While preparing today's video, I learned a new word. So, the word of the day is Incensepunk, which as it turns out is kind of absolutely my jam. Incensepunk, as I've now learned, is kind of like high-tech, high church, so like it's a very gothic feeling. Think of Warhammer 40,000, you know, the high-tech space futuristic, but also deeply drenched in religion with a lot of Gothic, Catholic, Byzantine like imageries. You know, everything's a church or a cathedral. There are candles and censers and torches and bones and all that sort of stuff. That, at least to me, I think, is what Incensepunk is. And today's book absolutely nails that aesthetic. It even gets the sort of dreary dread that I feel comes along with a lot of that iconography. The book we're going to talk about today is The Hand of God by Yuval Kordov. Set in the future after Earth has been ravaged by not one but two separate apocalypses, The Hand of God shows us the aftermath of these apocalypses, the first of which was caused by man. The common story of man's greed, pride, anger, leading to war, leading to climate change, leading to nuclear apocalypse. But following that, we find out that yeah, God is real and he's upset that you destroyed the world, and so he comes and destroys the world again as punishment for mankind's sin. In the aftermath, we are introduced to three different groups of humanity, each representing different ideologies, survival strategies, different paths forward for the human species. And as we explore them, we see how they interact with each other, we see how they rub against each other at the borders, and we see how their different ideologies struggle to adapt to one another. The first and probably most interesting of these factions that we're kind of introduced to is the people who live in Cathedral, labeled the Last City, and their leaders, the Revenant Sisterhood. Led by a long-lived, perhaps immortal, woman known as Esther. The Revenant Sisterhood are these all-powerful women with near magical, supernatural abilities that has been granted to them by Esther and their messiah that they see through some secretive ritual and some secretive substance. The Revenant Sisterhood and Cathedral as a whole, and Esther especially, drips this semi-religious but corrupted feeling. Esther sees and trusts the messiah, and that might blind her to what's going on around her, because what we see doesn't seem so much like a miracle given by God, but something far darker and far more demonic. Next, we have Bastion, this militarized church city-state, representing something closer to normalcy that we would recognize, but overridden by this militaristic culture, by this religious dogmatic culture. The church and the military are two of the three pillars upon which Bastion society is constructed, and they work alongside each other very closely. Squads of soldiers will have priests within them who will perform prayers and rites before and after battle. The entirety of Bastion itself is built around the idea of defending humanity from the demonic hordes that live in the waste. What we get is very reminiscent of sort of a World War I Western Front feeling army of, you know, trenches and defenses and tunnels and defending wherever you can. We have this very religious feeling over the entirety of Bastion that just gives it this flavor, this lovely culture on top of the militarism that is just really fantastic. And finally, the third power is more of a minor power. Currently under the thumb of the Cathedral and the Revenant Sisters is the Union. This is a group of families, a group of tribes of scavengers from the wastelands. People that have learned to survive outside the walls of these two major cities, and people who have learned how to scavenge and sell what they find to make ends meet. Whereas Cathedral and Bastion both seem very interested in protecting their walls, protecting what humanity is, the Union feels more okay with adapting to their environment, adapting to their needs, and just trying to eke out a living where they can. Jumping into the things I really liked about this book, because, spoiler alert, I really liked this book. One of them is absolutely just the religious symbolism, the religious imagery, the religious passages, the religious tone of the book. I dig all that. I'm not a religious person, but religion fascinates me. And this book explores faith and the human condition and religion in a world where we know these things are true. That's fascinating to me. I love books where the question of the Almighty, the question of a god or gods, isn't a question. Like, it has been proven to be real, and now humanity has to adapt to that. And this is a really, really interesting view of that. And then you've got the Revenant Sisterhood, who are following their own version of this religion, but with these other layers on top that make it very complex and very interesting. And the way these religions interact with each other and kind of mirror each other in certain ways is super fascinating. Speaking of the Revenant Sisterhood, the sort of mysterious aura surrounding them. The Revenant Sisterhood are the ones that feel the most Warhammer 40k to me, and in such a good way, in that sort of, yes, they're dogmatically following their faith, they are militaristic, but there's clearly something dark going on here. There's some terribleness at the core of this that we have to explore, and this book does that in a really fascinating way, and at times in very shocking ways. And at the core of the Revenant Sisterhood, I can't talk about them without talking about the thing on the cover that drew me to the book, the war mechs. So yeah, in this book, there are war mechs, these giant war machines. Think closer to a like mech warrior than they are to the Titans of Warhammer 40k. But they are these giant machines of our past, well, of their past, when mankind got to the technology level to be able to deploy these just before the war ended. And now they are these rare, almost relics, antique relics of massive power, more powerful than anything anyone else can field. And the question of how the Revenant Sisterhood has war mechs and how they run them is pretty core to the story and very, very well explored. I also really love the characters. There are like 3 or 4 main characters, I would say, here, and they're all pretty well fleshed out. They're all really quite interesting. They all feel pretty unique, and they all have their own ambitions and goals. And none of their motivations are confusing. They all make sense and feel like pretty well fleshed out real people. And probably the best bit of this book is just the world building. It is this fascinating world with these 3 major powers of humanity that are surviving in this blighted wasteland with strange anomalies taking place in certain parts of it, like hell mouths and seas of screaming people and just terrible hellscapes. It really does feel like the Earth has dropped down into some of the upper levels of hell, and that is exhibiting itself on the planet. And what's more, as part of this world building, we're introduced at times to the demons, because the demons exist, they roam the wastes, and they are probably the core problem that humanity has to deal with. And they are the best example of otherness that I think I've ever read. They're not, pitchfork-wielding little devils and stuff. They are part mechanical, part biological. They're not of this world. They're not built to exist in our reality, so they constantly phase in and out of our reality. They can appear and disappear in different areas where you're not expecting them. And they are just this terrifying threat that is perhaps not touched on as much as I would have loved in this first book, but I'm expecting a bit more of it later on, but is just so tantalizing that I am just so excited to read the next one. I really only have kind of one criticism of this book, and it's perhaps my fault for not reading the back cover. If I'd read the back cover of this book, I would realize that Esther is the head of the Revenant Sisterhood, the head of Cathedral. But I didn't read the back cover before reading this, and so the first 8 chapters or something that are like a prologue with Esther surviving the apocalypse and Esther surviving in the near post-apocalypse. And I was reading it, and I was just kind of like, well, this is not the sort of, Incensepunk, giant war mech, religious stuff I was expecting, because this is just kind of like a post-apocalyptic story of a girl surviving in the post-apocalypse. And I was thinking it was just kind of showing us what that world looked like instead of showing us the origins of Esther. So really, it's fine. It does, I think, perhaps drag on a little bit too long. It is, for me, the weakest part of the book. So if you start the book and feel a little bit iffy in the first bit, just push through, because I think that once you get past that opening prologue section, it really picks up and is really, really fascinating. That's it for me today. That is my review for The Hand of God by Yuval Kordov. And as I said, I loved it. I'm giving this book a 9 out of 10, which is a high rating, but I think this is just a fantastic book. One of the best I've read in a very long time. I cannot wait to get to the sequels, which I already own. They're on the shelf, and I've been holding off reading them until I record this review. So basically, I think as soon as I turn this camera off, I'm going to start book 2. So thank you so much for watching. If you want to pick up a copy for yourself, there is a link in the description below. But overall, just make sure to keep reading. Ciao.